transmission and reliability. Like, especially when there are so many religious texts around. So, what really makes in the way the Holy Bible, its origin, its transmission, reliability, what really makes it unique? We have many religious texts in the form of the Greeks, or take the many religions that we have in India, be it Buddhism, be it Hinduism. There are many religious or sacred texts. But what really makes Bible unique? Before really jumping into the topic, there is something that I would like to state that, you know, faith. This is a quote from Saint Augustine. Like, faith is the first step to understanding. Okay? Faith is the first step to understanding, and understanding is the reward of faith. Like, why I'm actually saying is that, in science, for example, uh, if they come across something very strange, they don't dismiss science as such, but they really are open to understand, to seek, like, how could science or how could a better theory explain it? So same thing, we may come across many, sometimes many things which are doubtful, which may cause doubt, but I think we should always start with faith first, and then later on, for example, there is some people might come up and say, hey, the texts are all different, the what is quoted in one gospel is different from the other. Those kind of, say, contradictions some people apparently may point out, but I think that should not really jar us in our faith. The reason I'm saying is because when the novel The Da Vinci Code was launched, I never studied history or biblical history before. Like, I did not really understand. So when some of the things, I think, of course, they are actually telling it for the sake of selling the novel, which I later understood. Because the author said, like, whatever is quoted historically, quoted in the Da Vinci Code novel is true and all. Like, it was pretty shocking that someone could make that. Then later on, I understood that many biblical scholars or actual historians really, they just called out the bluff later on. So with this, let's dive into how the Bible came into being. So the Bible is it's a divine library. The Bible itself means it's a collection of books. It's We have 39 Old Testament books and New Testament 27 books. It is written over 1500 years by 40 plus authors across three continents. So most of the Old Testament was written in Asia. And then in Africa, when the Israelites were in Egypt, that was written. And if we take the New Testament epistles, that was written in Europe. So, but it tells of one unified story. Okay. So, as I said, Bible means it's a book. It is derived from the Greek word Biblia, and Bible is both a historical record and a revelation of God's will. In my undergraduate, I remember asking, like, oh, why isn't Jesus mentioned? I mean, why don't we have any historical books telling about Jesus? And one of my seniors said the Bible itself is a historical book. At that time, unfortunately I did not realize it then. Till my senior pointed it out that the Bible itself is a historical book. So that was again an eye opener for me. Moving on, what are the languages that the Bible was primarily written in? Okay, so most of the Old Testament was written in Hebrew. It was called as a Paleo Hebrew. I might get some of the translations of the names wrong, but it is called as a Paleo Hebrew. Paleo Hebrew, it is the language in which most of the Bible was written, and parts of the Old Testament of Daniel and Ezra are written in Aramaic, and then uh, we have it's called as, I think, Koine Greek, I believe, which is the language of the New Testament. So much of the New Testament Bible was written in Koine Greek. It is said to be the lingua franca of the at the time of Jesus, because just like English was spoken today, how it was widely spoken today, so at that time the Greek was actually spoken. Just one tidbit: when we read the Bible in English, right? For example, between First Peter and Second Peter, we do not really see the difference in the languages. For example, First Peter, I think it was written with the help of another person, and so it may sound a bit good Greek. But Second Peter happens to be, they say the language, the original language, seems to be a bit crude. And if we take the Luke's gospel or his Acts, they say it approaches a classical level of Greek. So, but that is something that we don't see it in the Bible today because it is translated, and most of us either read it in our vernacular languages or we read it in English. Okay. So, how did it all start? So, before the uh, Bible was actually recorded, people had, for example, Moses was actually given, I mean, he is believed to have authored the first five books of the Old Testament. And so I used to wonder, like, how did Moses write? Like, he was not there, were there during the time of Adam and Eve. Like, did the Holy Spirit really, reveal to him? How did that? I think the answer lies in a bit of both. He was obviously inspired by the Holy Spirit, but it started with oral tradition. So back in the days when script people did not have scripts, oral tradition is a very strong method or process of transmitting knowledge or history. Like people used to remember big, like huge genealogies or huge texts. They used to remember that, and they used to continuously recite in the community, in a big community. So oral tradition was strong, and oral tradition is important for those people in the ancient times because for them oral tradition is a way of remembering their identity. So forgetting was not an option. Second thing, they trained their mind, they trained their memory to really retain large portions of readings. Or to give a classical example, to give another example, how did they really remember so much of text or so much of songs and all? So it so happened that, for example, they used to use certain, what do you call, methods to remember. For example, parallelism, for example. So in parallelism, what was actually happening is that people, like, there are, what do you call, repetitions. Okay, repetitions is a way, just like we remember songs today uh, compared to, like, say, a text, just like, because that song has a particular structure, just like that. Previously those oral traditions also had structures. For example, you take one of the psalms, I think it was Psalm 119. Psalm 119 starts with it, like each verse, I mean, like each section starts with one alphabet of the Hebrew letters. So then, for example, or else they had parallelism. Like, in parallelism, what actually happens is, in poetry, in Hebrew poetry, there is something called as a parallel. Example, in Psalm 19 verse 1, it says, uh, the heavens declare the glory of God, and the skies proclaim the work of his hands. These two are similar. So they used to employ those structures to remember large parts of the history, be it songs, be it poetry. They used to remember, and they recited them continuously in a community, in a gathering, just like, probably you can see something in the background picture. So they used to remember that, and that's how the oral tradition was. And it is not unique to Israel's history itself. It is actually same across many civilizations across the world. Like, we actually had similar civilizations, for example, be it in the cultures that we find in India, be it the that's how even, well-known Greek texts like Iliad and Odyssey, they also were transmitted, just oral tradition. Even the Vedas, if we take the Hindu culture, or the Norse or any Celtic mythologies, also had a similar oral tradition before they were written down. Now, after this, uh, the Bible itself says that Moses began to record the law or the Torah. So this is the authorship was of the Moses was not very. It's actually not challenged. So, like, for example, if you take in Exodus 24:4, it says that the Moses wrote down all the words of the Lord. Even in Deuteronomy, it says 31:9 that Moses wrote this law and gave it to the priests. But it's just not that, not only Moses, even uh, even Even Joshua also, it says that Joshua also started writing the what the Lord had dictated. So from the Bible itself, we can see hints that Moses began recording the law. But later on, the scribes continue to record the history, prophecy, and poetry. And so, as people started, like for example, the prophets, later on we'll see, even the prophets also started recording it. And scribes are the ones who actually, faithfully copied or made manuscripts. So a manuscript means it's a written copy. That written copy could be written on anything. It could be a parchment paper, or it could be a goat skin, whatever was available at that time. So people started making copies of that. So if we'll first quickly look at the the broadly three. We'll first look at the Old Testament. The Old Testament is broadly divided into three types of writings. Okay, the first is the law. This is the first five books of Moses, from Genesis to Deuteronomy. This was written 1400 to 1200 years before Christ. This is the main foundation of the Jewish faith and worship. And yeah, like it, like if you look at Joshua 24:26 as well, it says that Joshua wrote these words in the book of the law. So um, so Joshua also seems to have added these some records and covenant renewals to the Mosaic writings. When I say Mosaic writings, I'm talking about the writings that Moses had done. So after this, then we have the prophets. So we have under the prophets, we have these books coming under the prophets, the Joshua, Kings, and the prophetic books like Isaiah, Jeremiah, etc., etc. They all come under the prophets. So under the prophets, we have like for example, if you look at Samuel, in 1 Samuel 10:25, it says Samuel wrote it in a book and laid it up before the Lord. Or if you take Ezekiel or Isaiah or Jeremiah, all those prophets, it's actually mentioned in the Bible that they explicitly wrote down their visions and messages. So all of these writings by the prophets became part of the prophets. Then we have the writings. This is the books of wisdom, poetry, reflection. They showcase the worship, wisdom, and life's lessons grounded in the faith. Okay. So now the question is, okay, many of these books were written, but when were they actually made into standard? Especially, we have so many years of across so many years, many people had written the books which are now contained in the Old Testament. So when did they actually come together? So especially when you have many copies or many such writings in circulation, when it is standardized, the process is called as canonization. So how did the canonization of the Old Testament occur? This process, it actually spanned across many centuries, and it was recognized by these priests, prophets, and scholars. What I mean by that is that when we had many texts in circulation, so people knew, like there was a general consensus, like okay, among the Jews, that okay, these are the texts, these are the texts which are written by prophets, these are the texts written by Moses, and these should be actually preserved. So the canon, I think, was likely confirmed between 400 to 200 BC. So I think in around 400 to 200 years before Christ, between that period, the Old Testament that we see today must have been formalized, as in must have been accepted. We'll also look at what are the different Old Testament texts which were in circulation at the time of Jesus. But it is believed that it was Ezra, after the Babylonian exile, that Ezra was the one who actually brought these books together which we now call as the Old Testament Bible. So, for example, at the time of Jesus, we see after Ezra has actually compiled them into one text, he put them together. There were three major manuscripts which were actually circulating at the time of Jesus. As I said, manuscript means it's a handwritten copy. So, what are the manuscripts which are circulating at the time of Jesus? The first one we call it as Proto-Masoretic text. It's called as Proto-MT. So this text was actually circulating near Judea and Galilee. So it was written in Paleo-Hebrew, and there is this language called as Square Aramaic, which later on became the modern Hebrew. So the synagogues at that time, they used to have these Torah scrolls in Hebrew, and in the synagogues people used to regularly gather, the Jews used to regularly gather, they read aloud and they explain this. They, since many of the people did not know Hebrew, whatever they read was explained in Aramaic for the people to understand, because Aramaic was the language that that was commonly spoken. So here is a question: which language do you think Jesus knew? It's a question for everyone. Which language do you think Jesus knew? You can just type it in the chat. Of course, there is no Aramaic. Okay, do you think Jesus was multilingual? Like, for example, yeah. Okay, so which all language you can guess? I mean, I know for, I mean, I know myself. Like, I think we can, to a large extent, we can say that Jesus spoke Aramaic, correct? Hebrew, Aramaic, yes, of course. That's why he was able to correct Greek. He was able to read the scroll of Isaiah in the synagogue. So Jesus knew Aramaic, Hebrew, and I think to a large extent to non-Jews, Jesus spoke in Greek, because Greek also was, as we saw, right, Greek was the normal spoken language. I mean, widespread used language during the Roman Empire. So yeah, coming back. So this is the Proto-MT. This is one of the Hebrew manuscript which was widely circulated. It is written completely in Hebrew, and then we have the something called as a Septuagint. I mean, I'm not sure if I'm getting this pronunciation right, but it's a Greek translation of the Hebrew text. There is a difference between Greek, the Septuagint, and the Proto-MT, but this Greek translation was widely used by the Jewish diaspora. So the Jews who were spread across other places like the Greece, or who are not actually in Israel at that time. So, for example, we had Jews in Alexandria, in Asia Minor, in Rome. So these were primarily using Septuagint, because that was, and because most of these Jews they didn't know Hebrew to read, so they were dependent on reading. Their reading is dependent on this Greek translation called Septuagint. So, but there is a difference between this Proto-MT and Greek Septuagint, in that the Septuagint also had some of the books which we do not have now. But nevertheless, it's a very good translation. Okay? And then there is the Samaritan translation of the Hebrew text or the Old Testament, that actually differed very considerably with the Masoretic text or the other Hebrew texts, or even with the Septuagint, because Samaritan texts had very considerable or significant variations. So, yeah, moving on. So, the Jewish Bible and the Christian Bible that we have today, the Old Testament, are they same or they different? Well, both of them had the same source. So there is a text called as Masoretic manuscript. Okay, it's called as Masoretic text, which was written uh, between 980 to 1009 AD. So that Masoretic text was, it became our modern Christian Bible, Old Testament. The same thing became the Jewish Bible. It is called, I think, Tanakh, but only the grouping and the order differs. The grouping and order of the Jewish Bible, the Tanakh, and the Old Testament differs, because this grouping and order also reflects the Christian view that Old Testament is pointing to Jesus, but both are based on the Masoretic text. For example, Jewish Bible has 24 books. Why? Because one Kings, two Kings, one Chronicles, two Chronicles, they were all clubbed into one. So the arrangement only differs, but otherwise, the Jewish Bible and the Christian OT are the same. So, so there is this Council of Jamnia. Okay. So what is this Council of Jamnia? It is during this Council of Jamnia, after the destruction of the temple in AD 70, that the Old Testament books were finalized or canonized. When I say Council of Jamnia, it's actually just a learning center, and many Jewish rabbis used to gather there to discuss over many years. So basically, here they just reaffirmed whatever is in circulation at that time. The proto Masoretic text of the Old Testament was there. Here in this Council of Jamnia, after the destruction of the temple in AD 70, they just reaffirmed that this is the God inspired scripture that we should follow for the Old Testament. I mean, not for the Jewish text. So this Jewish rabbis at this Council of Jamnia. So where was this Jamnia Learning Center was present was in today it's a place called as Yavne in Israel. In modern day Israel, it's called as Yavne. At this place, they actually discussed which book should become the canon, because as I said, right, the Septuagint and the other Hebrew texts which are in circulation at that time. So it was at this time that the 39 books of the Old Testament was confirmed or canonized. That's how, and the same thing was followed. Like later on, manuscripts that were made in the Old Testament, right? The older the books which are not canon, they were excluded. Okay, I'll come back to this a bit later. Okay, we'll move on to, yeah. So I was referring to some of the Masoretic text, right? So what is this Masoretic text? So the current translations, you take KJV or NIV of the 1984, the OT was based on this text called Masoretic text. Okay, so this is a text that the scribes who actually made these copies, they are called as Masoretes. They are called as Masoretes. And so this text was used to translate be it the KJV or most modern translations, which are directly translating, they are actually from the Masoretic text. So this is the authoritative Hebrew text of the Jewish as well as the most modern Bibles of the Christians. So this is the text. Now the question is, people, I understand, like there was oral tradition. I understand that people were making copies of their actual writing, but could there not be any human errors? Yes, there could be, but I just want to point out this Masoretic text was actually written in 9th century AD, after 9th century AD. So there is one discovery called the Dead Sea Scrolls that really, shook up. This discovery shook up because there were some Dead Sea Scrolls which were discovered in 1947, and these dates were ranging from 200 to 100 BC to 100 AD. So when people the Masoretic text was actually based on the earlier manuscripts, right? The Masoretic text, the copies were made from the earlier manuscripts. So till before 1947, the earliest manuscript that we had of the Old Testament was the Masoretic text. That means nearly 2000, like 1500 years later, like we actually the manuscripts that were passed on from 1500 years later, those became our source before 1947. But during 1947, they found more manuscripts And when we compared these manuscripts with the Masoretic text, the Sea Scrolls were before, like 200 BC, 200 AD, and the Masoretic texts are from after 900 AD. So there is a gap of around 1,000 years. Over the process of 1,000 years, the scribes were copying, making manuscripts, faithful manuscripts of the OT. And when they found 99.5% accuracy between the two. Dead Sea Scrolls also had that Hebrew base, and the Masoretic text also had this the Old Testament. When they compared the two, they found 99.5%. So what were the differences? The differences more like the differences between American English and British English. Like for example, American English emits O in color, like so those things. Otherwise, for example, the golden example will be the Book of Isaiah. When they compared it, that like there were very minor modifications. I mean, to imagine that over thousands of years of copying, the scribes actually had such a methodology that over 1,000 years, when they copied, the variation is just 0.4%. Just imagine that. So that's how remarkable in accuracy these texts are over thousands of years of copying. Okay. Just quickly checking, like you have any questions? I do understand. We'll open the forum for questions at the last, but if anything is not clear, if anything is the flow is not good, please let me know so I can just redo it again. Okay. Okay. Moving on. So now that we are done away with the OT, I just quickly recall. So OT, we had the oral tradition in place, and then the recording or the writing started off with Moses, because let's remember Moses actually was very well versed. He was a very educated man, especially being an Egyptian prince for the initial time of his life. He was, and it was at that time that the Hebrew language started getting its script. So that script means the writing letters that they had. So it was at that time, during the time of Moses, that I think the the first 5 books of the Old Testament was written. And later on, the as the prophets came in, they also started recording the writings. And if you actually notice also in the Bible also, there are many other books which are mentioned in the Bible. For example, from the books of the Annals of the Kings and all those things, those books are all lost now. But the Old Testament that we had today, its canonization began, especially in the form that we see today. I think it was during the time of Ezra, after the Babylonian exile, that the Old Testament books were actually started being put together. And then later on, by the time we come to the time of Jesus Christ, there were primarily or majorly 3 different Hebrew texts that were actually in circulation among the people. The people in Jerusalem, Judea, they all had a Hebrew text, and the synagogues also had a Hebrew text. The one which we see Jesus reading from the scroll of Isaiah, right? So it was a Hebrew text, and for the people, for the Jewish diaspora who are actually living outside of the Jerusalem or the Israel, near Alexandria or Rome, they were primarily referring to the Greek Septuagint. It's a translation, Greek translation of the Hebrew text, but it also had additional books. In fact, one quick tidbit: most of the the New Testament authors, like be it Matthew, they actually quoted from the Septuagint, not the Hebrew text. So whatever they quoted matches with the Septuagint. Just a quick tidbit. So, but then out of the 3 or the many texts that were actually in circulation, it was in the Council of Jamnia. Jamnia is a learning center. I've given the name of the rabbi also who established it. So at that time, the Jewish rabbis came together, they discussed a lot, and then they finalized that, okay, these are the canon, these are the books of the OT. And at that time, the most important was the Proto-Masoretic text. So that actually became a standard for the Masoretic text that the current modern translations are using. The current modern translations use a Masoretic text. It was from the 900 AD to 1000 AD. Okay, so that is the finest one. So to again conclude, the Jewish Tanakh and the modern Bible's Old Testament are same. The grouping is different and the order is different, but otherwise both are from the same source called Masoretic text. Okay, so let's move on to the New Testament. Okay, so how did the New Testament form? Like, so I just go, I put together a timeline for the New Testament. So I think that will make things easy to understand. Okay. Yeah. So we have the life and ministry of Jesus. Okay. Then after his life, this is just a rough period. Okay. So from 30 to 50 AD, we have the oral traditions where the apostles and the early church believers, they spread the message by preaching what they heard. They at the time it is believed that no empty books were written yet, but the sayings and Jesus and accounts of his resurrection, they were circulating widely across across the churches. They were circulating widely, and many of the apostles and the church leaders also, they started preaching the same thing, preaching the message about Jesus. It was not until AD 48 to 65. It is believed that Paul's epistles, which are essentially his letters to the churches or different churches, they were the earliest writings. So Romans, Corinthians, and Galatians, his epistles are the earliest known written empty texts. So these letters, which he shared to the churches, right, they were copied and shared among other early church Christian communities as well. Like I think it was in Second Corinthians that Apostle Paul mentions, like after this letter is read, you also send this same letter to the church at Laodicea. I correct me if I'm wrong, but so that's how the letters were actually copied. The gospel accounts were first written likely around by Mark. Okay, of the four gospels, we had Mark, Matthew, Luke, and John. And Mark was written around 60 to 70 AD. That is the earliest known or likely the first gospel. Matthew and Luke were written around 70 to 85, and John. Uh, so Mark, Matthew, Luke are also called as Coptic gospels because they find many of the things similar in their in the narration. John is completely different, but Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, it is said, it is believed, again, I do not know, but it is believed that some of the sayings of Jesus where they actually had a common source. There is some other source called as Q. Nobody knows what is it, but it is the scholars say that the Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, Mark, Matthew, and Luke had a common source. John was written around AD 90 to 100. It was written a much later time. And by the time we actually see the theology has much more developed. The John is, when we read John, it's pretty, it feels more mature. It feels the theology is more matured. It feels a bit intimate. And later on, we have the other books like the Acts, Peter, Revelation, other pastoral epistles, which were written before 100 AD. Now, it was from 100 to 150 AD where churches began gathering these apostolic writings. Okay, they started gathering and reading them in their worship. So there was something like the four gospels or something like the letters of Paul started, becoming a standard. And there also other Christian works also, like for example, it seems there was a shepherd of Hermas or one Clement. They started circulating. I'll tell you what those are. So it was in AD 150 to 300 where the churches started identifying that, okay, these epistles and these gospels are the standard ones. They started canonizing them, like in circulation. Like the other books which I said, like Shepherd of Hermas or One Clement, and there are many other, like the book, the Gospel of Barnabas, there are others. So they were more or less seen as either just a moral, or edifying books but they were not considered part of the canon. It was in AD 140 that a person named Marcion, he has created a heretical canon, and the church at that time they rejected this canon that was created by Marcion. And the books of Hebrews, James, and Revelation, it was during this time, there was not a very general consensus among the church whether they are part of the New Testament canon or not. But this thing got resolved by the time of 300 AD. There is by AD 367, there is this, especially this Council of Carthage, okay, in 397 AD. By the time Carthage, it was in Carthage, the church affirmed that okay, these books of the NT that we see today, it was reaffirmed as canon. I mean, they did not really include any books or decide, because by the time the churches knew which books are, canon, which books are actually inspired by the word of by the Spirit. So it was only in the Council of Carthage that the New Testament that we know of today, it became canon. So at the time, whatever manuscripts were in circulation after this this Council of Carthage, the scribes or the people or the Christian monks who were actually copying the New Testament, they knew which books to include or which books to copy and which books to exclude. So by the time of 500, like in the next 100 years, whatever was not decided as canon in the Carthage were completely dropped off. So the later manuscripts, especially after 400 to 500 AD, they started containing only the New Testament as we know today. So after this, the standard, the New Testament books are standardized. Then we also started having translations. So the earliest known translation is the Jerome's Latin Vulgate. It was translated at around 405 AD. It became the standard Bible for the Western Church. So again, these manuscripts were preserved by monks for, over the next couple of years, hundreds of years. They actually made copies of it because at the time they did not have printing press, obviously, so they were copied. So, what are the reasons that this particular 27 books were actually chosen as canon? What are the primary reasons is, they said that any book which had an apostolic authorship, or it should be connected with the apostle. Second, whatever the text was saying, they should align with the teachings of the Jesus and apostles. So at that time, there are two. The teachings of the church was divided into two: the kerygma and the didache. Kerygma is nothing but the gospel. The didache is the teachings of the apostle. Okay, so they had to align with them. So based on this, the canon was decided. As I said, right, like by 150 AD, most of the NT books were recognized, and whatever differences they had regarding the Hebrews, they were, again, in the next 100 years, it was decided, and it was in the Council of Carthage that 27 book canon was formalized. So, just to recall, what is a manuscript? Manuscript is nothing but a written copy of a book. Okay. So let's first look at manuscripts of the New Testament. I think the question really that comes is like, if the original texts were actually not known, like for example, Apostle Paul must have written an epistle. We do not have the original document of that now. So what we have are the copies of the copies of the copies. So this is the issue with the ancient literature. Okay, I'll just give an example. When it comes to ancient literature, New Testament has the highest number of manuscripts. How many manuscripts does it have, like that we know of today? There are over 5,800 handwritten copies of New Testament in Greek. And if we go to other languages, like translations, it has more than 20,000 manuscripts. So the total estimate, total we have around 24,000 manuscripts of the New Testament across all languages. Now a quick question. In this ancient literature, the second one, the second most reliable book is the Iliad's Odyssey. It's a Greek mythology book. Can you guess how many manuscripts that book has? Can anyone guess how many manuscripts that book has? Any guesses? Okay. It has overall 650 manuscripts. I mean, what is remarkable is that compared to any ancient work, New Testament has far more copies. Homer's Iliad and Odyssey, it has just 650 manuscripts. And many of the other classical works that we have, like we have writings about Alexander the Great, they have less than 20. And there is one more thing very remarkable. The time gap between the original writings and the earliest surviving copies of the New Testament is less than or close to 100 years only. For Iliad, it is 500 years. And for the other texts, it is more than that. It's nearly 1,000 years. So what if the manuscripts are there? First thing, if we have that much abundance of manuscripts, it becomes easy for scholars to cross check. There is this method called as textual criticism. Okay, let me there is this process called as textual criticism. In textual criticism, what actually they do is that they take all of these manuscripts together. For example, I am there. I gave one manuscript to each of you. Okay. And then I ask you, hey, what is the first letter, first word? All of you tell. They see, okay, this first word is there in majority of the manuscript. So let me lock it down. In this way, scholars, if the number of manuscripts is more, scholars are able to really reconstruct the original text. So this process, they use this process called as textual criticism, and that's how we know that the NT manuscripts, I mean, having 25,000 manuscripts in different languages really helps us to reconstruct the original text. Okay. That's why it is very significant. Like no other book can actually come very close. Like 650, 25,000, there is not even a comparison. So that's why we are sure we know. One more very significant thing is that for many of the texts, okay, like for example, if you take Alexander the Great, so the texts that actually were about him, over a period of 300 to 500 years, people started including mythological things about him, like that he was a godlike being, that he had wings on his feet and flying and all. Even some of the texts about Christ that came on later on, like after 300 to 500 years, the new texts that actually had come had things like, after Jesus came out of the tomb, his head, he was so tall, his head was touching the sky. So that kind of, fantasy started creeping into it. That's the reason why the NT that we have today and the process in which it actually came about, that the earliest surviving text that we have, the original writings were less than 100, is very, very significant. So it is close to what the eyewitnesses have seen and what they have passed on faithfully. Okay, so currently the original texts were actually lost, but these are the texts that we had. I've written it here. So Codex Sinaiticus, it's a complete Bible in Greek. Then we have Codex Vaticanus. Again, it is one of the oldest copies, complete copies. Then we have Codex Alexandrinus. These are the manuscripts of the New Testament that we have. And one point to note is that the Sinaiticus and Vaticanus also have some of the Apocrypha books. When I say Apocrypha, books which are not canon. So these also have some of the books, but especially after the Council of Carthage, when the copies of these copies are being made, right? The scribes or the monks, Christian monks who were copying, they started dropping those books. And that's why, by the time of 400 to 500 AD, the like if you like, I think there is this manuscripts called as Byzantine manuscripts. By the time it was there, the NT has been completely, stripped of the Apocrypha books, and only the NT survived. So, okay, fine. You are saying that these manuscripts are there. So where are these manuscripts? We'll have a quick look. So this is an I used AI to generate, so you'll actually find some errors, the word spelling mistakes. So please don't mind. But so Codex Sinaiticus and Alexandrius, they are all there in the. For example, Sinaiticus is there in the British Library. You can just type it into the browser or in Google. You'll be able to digitally see this. What are these manuscripts? So Codex Vaticanus is there in France, in Paris, and Codex Alexandria is in Cambridge. But this is a map showing where all currently these manuscripts are present. Okay. So just another point to note: the textual transmission which the Jewish scribes used is again pertaining to the Old Testament. It is very, very, very meticulous. They after copying a particular text, they used to count down how many words are there in the old text and on the new text. They also used to find out what is the central letter. To that extent, they employed these methodologies when they are actually doing the copying. So this is how the Jewish scribes or the Christian monks ensured that when they are copying it, the errors are actually minimized. Okay. And I think this is something that we have already discussed. Thus, Bible stands uniquely reliable, especially, and this all would not have happened without the guidance of the Holy Spirit. Obviously, I mean, when we look at the numbers, it's incomparable. So, yep. So that is how it is. So just a quick note: KJV, how the KJV was translated. KJV was translated using the Old Text. For the Old Testament of the KJV was translated using the Masoretic text, same one. But the New Testament was actually based on a manuscript of the 15th century. And the later NIV, I'm talking about the NIV 1984 edition. It was translated again. For the Old Testament, they used the same old Masoretic text. But for the New Testament, they used the Greek Septuagint, and they used earlier ones, the Codex Sinaiticus and Codex Vaticanus was these actually used for the translation of the NIV 1984 version. I'm talking about, not the modern version. So this is the summary. So from the oral tradition to written word of God, this is a brief history of how the Bible came to be. So this is it from my side. Sorry, I'm just over to Kranti. Like I don't know what should we do from now.
Yeah, we can have some questions.
Yeah. Before that, the forum is open. I'm not a scholar as such, but I studied. I actually referred to primarily two books. One is I had a book which one of my good friend and brother Jacob suggested. It has a history. It's called Bible, its history and its influence. I'll share the name also here. And then there is one more book called as The Case for Christ by Lee Strobel. Most of you must be knowing. So it's also a very interesting book because especially there is a section about how the New Testament manuscripts were made, why actually it stands apart from the other ancient texts. Yeah, sorry. Here, over to you, Pradeep.
Yeah, we can ask questions. One question that came is how is it compared to olden? How is it compared to oldest Indian literature?
Oh, where is it?
Yeah, it came personally to me.
Okay, 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 okay. I am not really sure of that, but of course, that's a good question. See, I am not really sure what is the oldest surviving or the earliest known text for Indian literature because, see, for example, like there are many texts like Mahabharata, many Vedas, or like many or Upanishads. Okay, so I don't think any of them are okay. How many of you know Ramayana? Like anything about Ramayana? There are different versions of Ramayana. Okay, where the major portions of the Ramayana were actually changed to suit. Okay, so there is some angle that actually we can check, but like for example, I remember studying in my school that um, Valmiki's Ramayana was different, and later on, people who again who copied the Ramayana, they made changes because they did not like a particular version or event that was speaking about Rama. So they were actually changed. So if the second known, best known book which had the best manuscript itself is 650 manuscripts, you can imagine what other literatures around the world actually has. Let me just confirm. I'll actually get back to you on this. But if the second, when it comes to the reliability, the second itself is Homer's Iliad, which has 650 scripts, and other texts are actually having much less than 220. You can imagine the number of scripts or manuscripts that the in Indian literature actually has. In fact, I'll just tell one thing. There were so many. I knew a colleague when I was working in Renault Nissan 10 years back. He was actually telling that the texts that we have, Ramayana and Mahabharata, are there are many other stories that are actually omitted. He says these stories are actually you will not find it anywhere, but he used to get small copies of it from a temple nearby, and he actually told some of the contents of those texts. It was shocking that he said like I have become an atheist after reading that because it's pretty what do you call regressive nature. But what I want to say is that the way it was copied or it was spread, it's very it's not very what do you call clean or neat. Like there are so many traditions. Like they say Mukkoti Devatal, like 3 crores or 30 crores, I don't know. So you can imagine the kind of scattered resources that the Indian literature actually has.
There's one question that came. There is large number of arguments against Bible saying that people who translated made changes as per the doctrine which derived later. For example, Trinity.
Yeah, the Trinity is a word that I think you won't find it in the Bible. Trinity is nowhere mentioned in the Bible. So, um, if you look at if you look at the Bible that you have, if it's a pretty good modern translation, you will actually see in the subscripts like they mention, for example, they'll mention clearly. Okay, this is not, for example, if you take NIV 1984 version, it mentions clearly, like for example, uh, marks. I think like later portions are not present. They actually mention it clearly. Like the earlier manuscripts do not have this. So biblical scholars, they say yes, it is true that some of the changes were made, but none of them have said that it was changing the core concepts or the theology of the Bible. None of them actually have said that it changes the theology of the Bible. So people who said who actually are claiming that during translation it was the changes were made, we do have the original text also available. And as I said, right, the original texts are also available. You can see it digitally. So unless and until at least the modern Bible that we have, the Protestant Bible that we follow, it's more or less, not more or less, it's to a large extent remains true to the original text. And whatever additions were made, right, they don't change the message of the Bible. They don't really change. Like for example, Trinity is not a word that actually appears in the Bible at all. It is something that outside we discuss a concept, but if you see the Bible, um, yeah, I don't think any text was added that will really change the theology of the Bible as a whole.
Any questions? We have around 9 people here. Anyone has any question? We can type. Okay. Yeah, so there's one question about this copying. If right now, if we don't have original text as written by the author, how can we say it is reliable? Like, what is the reliability factor?
Sorry, what's
New
that? Can you
Testament.
type?
Yeah.
Can you type that?
Yes, yes. I'll type.
Yeah. 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 So, yeah, that's where actually many manuscripts actually come into play. Um, the original texts that were written, be it the epistles or the gospels, we had copies of those texts. So, as I was mentioning, right, like the in the Greek language itself, in which the New Testament was written, we have 5,000 copies of it. 5,000 copies of it. And if you look at the translations, we have 20,000 copies of it. So, so the scholars used this method called as textual criticism, as I said, right? So they take these copies, they actually compare each and every word, okay, and by that they were able to reconstruct the original texts. So, especially that's how we actually know. For example, for your question about what is the reliability that they copied it, say, I think the classic example is that of the Old Testament. See, the before 1947, right? The oldest known text that we have is the Masoretic text, which was written in 900 AD. So, if it was written in 900 AD, and in 1947, there was a discovery called as the Dead Sea Scrolls discovery. So, Dead Sea Scrolls had multiple texts, multiple. They had the Proto-Masoretic text, Hebrew Bible. They have the Samaritan Hebrew Bible. They had the, I mean, sorry, Hebrew Old Testament. They also had the Septuagint. Okay, so when they took the Hebrew Bible and they compared with the Masoretic text, like 99.5% of it is matching. The minor variations are all just this the like for example, as I said, right, they're just minor modifications. They did not make any changes to the theology or the message of the text. So this, and also when we compare the manuscripts, right, like across 5,000 manuscripts, across other translations also, like the variations are actually very minimal. If especially if we look at the 27 texts of the New Testament, the variations are very minimal. Like even if the variations are taken into consideration, the message has not changed. The message has not changed at all.
Yeah. Anyone wants to share anything from your experience from the group? Like in this time, like around this topic, if you want to share anything, we can share. Okay. Okay. Thank you so much, Vipin. Thank you for taking time and preparing and presenting.
Yeah, I was just checking the Hindus one. It seems The people do not know how many manuscripts the Vedas have, for example. But the most recent was dating to the 1464 AD. That is preserved in Pune. That's the latest that actually I have. So Vedas were mostly, unlike the Old Testament or New Testament, Vedas were not exactly copied. So
Mm.
much of it, I don't know how reliable are they then otherwise, you know.
Mm.
So because the latest known manuscripts of the Rig Veda, for example, oldest one, is from the 14th century AD,
Mm.
which I think is not even a comparison. Like,
Mm.
although
Mm.
people say they have lots of manuscript, but there are no reliable manuscript for the
Mm.
Vedas.
Mm.
Okay.
Mm. Thank you. Thank you so much.
Yeah.
Okay. Okay. We'll close. Before we close, we have a very small group of people. Ashley is there. Jasu, Ramya, Shruti, Ram Prakash.
Okay.